Hey Peyton, nice to see you again on this beautiful day. And this time with a quote by Adyashanti again. And here's what he says. The sense of a fixed self is the primary obstruction to freedom. It is a cage built from our own unexamined thoughts. What do you think about this if you examine your thoughts, Peyton?
Good to be back, my friend. This is a truth or an insight that's at the core of almost all spiritual traditions, that our self-identity, our view of ourself, our narrative, and our stories about who we are and what we want and don't want is ultimately a web that we ourselves spin of our own thoughts, that typically our starting point that's conditioned is that we don't see through the web. And so we have this self-image, this self-identity, this homunculus in the center of the head. And we adopt this view that we're this separate being cut off from the world, that's alienated from the rest of existence, that must fight and claw and defend and anticipate and protect ourselves for our own survival and provision and protection. And we're kind of born into this by our culture, whether East or West. It's pretty much ubiquitous that we start off with this point of view that I'm really here. I have this name and this identity, and I own this body. I have these possessions, and I'm cut off. I'm not interconnected with all that is, and I'm certainly not the interconnected reality itself, but rather I'm this separate organism. And therefore, I need to figure out the future. I got to protect myself from all these threats. I got to protect myself from that person over there. I need to protect my identity about myself, the stories that I tell about myself. If they look like they're true or look like they're being falsified, I got to get defensive. I got to tell myself a different story that covers over it. And this view at the center of all of it that we rarely question or that we rarely see through is, am I really who I think I am? Am I really the thinker inside of my head? Am I really this stream of thoughts and narratives and identities that is cut off from everything else that needs protected and defended? Or are all of those thoughts, is that identity, is that self-image, is that narrative, is that body, is that emotional feeling, is that pain or joy, is all of that appearing within something that is not cut off? Is all of this appearing within the light? Is all of this appearing within the capital S self or Christ consciousness or the Atman or whatever we want to call it? Is the light primary in who I ultimately am? And that perspective can be really elusive. And even when we recognize it and see it, we can blind ourselves again into thinking that we're cut off again and we're this little organism that's separate and needs to protect itself and needs to try to defend itself from these threats from all angles. And to the extent that we readopt that view that we're this separate identity and that it's really fragile and that it needs protected, we will inevitably suffer. We will inevitably struggle against reality because reality is outside of our control. And so we can't ultimately control it. We can't ultimately protect ourselves from all the things we don't want or hold on to all of the things that we want. And all of these fears, all of these attachments are ultimately rooted in the same ground, which is who we take ourselves to be. And when we can awaken from that and see who we really are, our true nature, our identity, there is an intrinsic freedom in that has the capacity for all of these things that we want or don't want that come and go and the universe that we can't control. And so in the storms, when we feel ripped apart and fragile and like we're so threatened, actually waking up from this dream of the prison is the most powerful trump card that we can bring to all of it. How do you think about this experience of identifying with the thinker, identifying with the small self versus seeing that maybe all of that is appearing within the light?
Yeah, definitely when we identify with the thinker, it is like Adyashanti says, we build a cage for ourselves because our degrees of freedom we can experience are limited to this identity we have. If we say about ourselves, I'm this kind of person. I'm a slow kind of person. I need my space, and I'm happy when I'm alone. And then we are in society, and are at a party, wherever. And then if we still identify with that, then we tend to pull ourselves back and feel uncomfortable. But this is only because of the cage we build ourselves. But this is also different from preferences. And if we identify ourselves as likable people, but then we receive a message of rejection and say, hey, I don't want you to write me. And this feels very hurtful as long as we identify ourselves as a person which is likable and has to be liked by everyone. But as soon as we realize that we can detach from our identities, from our ego needs of feeling safe and secure, and like you said, pulling the trump card inside this emotional storm, then we have a much higher degree of freedom, because then we can examine our thoughts again and say, this thought particularly is only targeted towards this identity I thought I had, because I didn't realize that only my thought structure made up all this kind of identity. And only with this kind of surface, we can receive the harm which is done to the identity. So it's actually only the identity which wants to self-preserve and protect itself through you taking an action and pulling yourself back and feeling hurt and feeling dark and dim. So the identity in its trial to self-preserve will give you, if you don't become aware of this thought pattern, will give you another lens through which it shows the world to you. You will see it much more gray, much darker. You will much more likely let yourself be pulled into a loop of negative emotions and thoughts and feelings, only if you don't examine your thoughts, only if you're still unaware that this is just a pattern, that this is just some kind of energy or pendulum which wants to self-preserve and wants to feed off of the energy which is around it. And therefore you can just say, freedom is another word for nothing left to lose. What if you lose your identity of a highly successful business person? Yeah, then you're free to just explore the world as a traveler, whatever. Lost an old identity, like a shell from a lobster, only to be vulnerable for some time, to grow into something more big, more beautiful, and maybe even harder than before. So it is about letting go of the sense of self, of the thinker, through becoming aware of the thoughts of the thinker, which is not you who observes the thoughts of the thinker. And then reclaiming your freedom through letting go of this cage, because every thought is like a web from the spider, which spins its web. And as soon as you want to go forward, you will stay stuck like a fly who wants to escape. How do you think of this metaphor of the thoughts being like a web of the spider?
It's very true. It's very true. And they're like a web in the sense that they cover up our view oftentimes, or divide ourselves from the single eye and recognizing the now. They also are like a web in the sense that if you get enough layers of that web, it makes us rigid. And we can see the image of two trees in the wind, and one of them is very rigid and firm, and the other blows in the wind. And it's the one that's firm that snaps and breaks and experiences great pain. And in fact, that snapping and breaking is oftentimes a step on our journey with this whole thing, and not a fun one necessarily, but this feeling of ego death. And obviously the Eastern traditions are really big on this, and the Western traditions too, though. And for Christianity, for one, you can see John 12:24, where Jesus says, unless a kernel of wheat dies and falls to the ground, it will remain just one. But if it dies, it will produce many grains, or produce much fruit. and obviously his death and resurrection is a central image in this. And Paul says, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me.
Mm.
And what does this mean? To be crucified with Christ, or for the grain of wheat to fall and die in the ground. And this is referring to ego death, referring to the death of our identity with this separate, cut off, I am over here defending myself from this whole world over there, and waking up to this one unified light, the light that's already always here, within which we see our headless body descending down, and we can see our hands that terminate upward, and we don't know what. We don't see our own chin or our own face. We can see the entire visual field appearing as one totality, as one expansiveness with no real center. Thoughts arise, but we actually don't author them when we pay attention. We think we create our thoughts, but if you actually just sit there and observe, you see that they kind of emerge like a sound, and they have predictable sources or patterns, but yet we aren't actually upstream deciding what we choose or deciding what we think. And ultimately, from a different perspective, there is just one totality. There is just the dancing light, and our ego self, our separate identity, the story that we have about ourselves, all our thoughts, the energetic pain or pleasure, and our body, our sounds, our physical sensation, they just arise as one wholeness ultimately. And when we can, or when we're broken by our life, by the world, and when we pay attention to this, eventually we struggle so hard to defend our little self, pay attention, and it just, at some point, it collapses. And we see that we don't actually have to hold on to this or defend this little thing, or grasp onto the pieces of our identity that we're wrapped up in or that we feel attached to. And that actually, in abandoning all of this and abandoning the attachment to identifying with who we used to take ourselves to be, we can let go of it all, and we can wake up to the fact that that actually never was who we ultimately are. The centerless light, or the awake space, is always who we are. And that this consciousness, this awareness, is the creating source, and it's interconnected with all beings. And it's a different level of recognition, this ultimate reality. But when relative reality, the things that we want and don't want, this little identity and this self and thoughts and narratives that arises within the ultimate reality, when that becomes overwhelming to us or too much for us to bear, or the storm is too powerful for us to stand firm in without breaking, then actually surrendering to all of that, surrendering all of these clingings and surrendering our rigidity, and just letting go into all that is with no effort. This can awaken us to a different level of reality, of just the light, and the light is appearing as everything that arises. And in this, we kind of can wake up from the prison dream. And these thoughts that we have, all the things that we want, that we're attached to, all the things that we fear, it is like spinning a web around us. It is kind of like a cage, like Adyashanti says. And this possibility is that if we're in a dream and we're in a prison in the dream, then we might be tempted in the dream to try to saw through the bars. We might be tempted in the dream to try to call out to the guard and try to convince him to unlock our cage. And the logic of this, of thinking that we're this individual in this dream, in this cage, that really must grapple with the cage by the logic of the dream, at some point there is this opportunity to actually cut through that logic and to just wake up from the dream and realize that prior to our thoughts, prior to our patterns and resistances of the futures and our attachments and the things that we think we need to happen or need to not happen, when we see the silence that's prior to the arising of the thoughts, when we feel the openness that's prior to our identity or our grasping onto a particular image or narrative within the thoughts, then we can see that in some way, right now, in this moment, right here, we're already free. Reality is already unbound by any of the requirements that we habitually put onto it. And this can happen just for a brief instant of relief before we kind of find ourselves back in the prison dream. But just touching this, tasting this, feeling this brief glimpse of freedom, this can help us in the most potent contractions of our life, when we feel like we're helpless and confused and we can't do anything and everything is falling apart and everything is threatening us and we can't overcome what's going on and we're just overwhelmed by the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. This is the final move that's actually always already available to us that can provide relief even in the hardest storms. And this is recognizing that we aren't the character in the dream that we've taken ourselves to be. This character that feels so threatened isn't ultimately who we really are. And so feeling this and glimpsing for ourselves, experiencing for ourselves, not as some concept, but as real waking up to the light that's already going on everywhere and feeling that I'm actually not the thinker. I'm actually not the separate homunculus in the head that's pulling the levers with volition, that's trying to control reality, that's cut off from all of reality. That's in some way, ultimately, an illusion. And in recognition of that, we can actually glimpse a freedom that's always already available. And that can be so helpful when the things going on are overwhelming to us, when we're ensconced in fear and confusion. This can be sometimes those things are bigger than what the separate thinker guy can solve. Sometimes they're actually overwhelming and beyond our control. And in those moments, just dying to self, letting go of our patterns, letting go of anything needing to be any way, this can enable us to reset. This can be our shelter in the storm that we can really feel and connect with. How do you think about finding this? And unfortunately, it can be hardest to see this when we're at our most confused.
Mhm.
And so, what does this mean as a way to experience relief when we're in our darkest places?
Well, these realizations don't come easy. Sometimes when we are inside in the midst of the storm of our own thoughts and of the turmoil which is happening around us. Then the pain is so hard and so high that we almost cannot bear it. Sometimes it happens when the pain is at its highest, that this kind of glimpse comes because the pain is so high that your identity and yourself cannot bear it. So it goes away or dies off for a moment, and then you can glimpse this kind of realization. If yeah, sometimes you're in nature as well and meditating for 10 days. This is also a possibility when moments like this can emerge. But this is a kind of different setting where you have to take yourself time for this. But most probable it will come when you feel such an amount of pain that there's no way to hide anymore. It's only to let go of this ego. This is a very spontaneous process which you cannot really control. But look out for it and you will maybe find what we are talking about and taste how this freedom tastes like. And this also reminds me of the picture of the donkey, where the donkey is just chained to like a very light plastic chair. But in his habitual conditioning and thought pattern as a donkey, hey, I'm a donkey, I get attached to a thing. That means I cannot move anywhere else. This is like imprisonment through our own self expectations. And also, sometimes these light moments of waking up mean, okay, you don't take action because you're inside this dream where you just associate certain kind of actions or certain kind of patterns you see in the outside world with limitations that you seemingly have. But sometimes you don't have these limitations, like the donkey who's only chained to this plastic chair cannot thinks he cannot move around. But what if he would only try a few random things and movements and try to move a little bit, try to move outside of its comfort zone? There's also a possibility to at least recalibrate yourself and your sense of identity through pushing through its boundaries and through its limitations. If you say to yourself, oh, I'm a shy guy, but then try and go outside and talk to a random person and ask for the time, even if you're a shy guy, this pushes your comfort zone. This pushes your sense of self-identification with shy guy. And you will realize now that story I've told myself is not true anymore. So there are small ways to widen your comfort zone as well, which loosen the grip which the identity has on yourself as well. So the donkey is definitely a metaphor and a reminder to myself that I myself am caging myself
Mm.
into my habitual structures and my habitual thought patterns and my habits overall. And if I don't like them anymore, if I feel pain because of what I do from day to day, and especially from what I don't do because I think I'm limited, then this pain also helps me to remember that, hey, I can move outside of my comfort zone, and then there's beauty to be found. There is some moment of hiking in the mountains again. I didn't hike for a long time because I thought I'm constrained to my laptop now because I need to try to lay a foundation for the business I want to start and so on. So I'm caging myself constantly and also take the responsibility that I have to push outside of my comfort zone again and again, because we will be pulled into a sense of identity. We will be pulled back into unexamined thought patterns again, because this is our default mode. This is how we operate in the world so that we don't die. But it is also very limiting to if we want to express our core truth and put this into the world and make it productive. So you can go either path, and I don't mind which path you chose to go, because in the end, it is your responsibility to architect the life you want. And then you can also go back and say, oh, I'm not only limited by a sense of identity and self, but I also can use it as a tool to widen the spectrum of possible ways I can act and I can behave and I can create habits for myself attached to another kind of identity. So I can be like a CNC tool where I just can exchange the head, like the self-identity I give myself. But this is only possible if you already know that there's this back layer of you as the observer, where you as the observer, as soon as you become aware of what you think, you will be able to at least not act on a negative thought spiral, for example. And then also take a step back and then detach this sense of self, put it back into the toolbox and see it for what it is. It is only a tool to help you to stay alive in a world which is very complex and sometimes has its dangers. An evolutionary scene has had its dangers, so it helped you to survive. And it also still is like this. If you experience something and then you kind of integrate that into your system, and then some people experience trauma and they have some certain kind of behavior patterns, this is only a pattern which helped you to stay sane and to survive in face of this big and hard challenge you faced. So seeing it for what it is, you can put it back into the toolbox and then imagine any tool you want and put it on top of your tool and then drill into the world as you want and create the path and architecture that you envision. How do you see this opportunity for ourselves to architect our own lives?
Mm. Mm. Yeah, this really is the promise of what's available in this is the ability to wake up from our patterns and redirect ourselves. I can say for myself in the past few weeks, really, I've been so blind to this. I've been very mistaken in my regular ways of seeing, and I perceived myself as this separate guy over here needing to defend himself from all that's going on over there or all that other people are doing over there. And in this has become rooted some patterns of intense psychological contraction in narratives about how somebody wronged me in some way or betrayed me in some way, or that I'm experiencing some wrongful situation that I really am resisting and wish was different, and that I have this anger or desire to lash back out at this or that situation, or this, even worse, sometimes even a mentality that I'm some victim of some situation. And what I've realized is, of course, there's some narratives that can be true on the surface about all of these things, but what what's become true is that these psychological patterns, they're all rooted in who I've taken myself to be. They're all rooted in the perhaps the diminished view that I really am some separate Peyton guy over here, cut off from all the world, needing to defend myself from and control all these things, and that I cannot have the capacity to feel this way or to experience this potential future. And what I've experienced in that is contraction and cutting myself off from the flow, trying so much to think through the future, to control events, or to prevent certain people from doing certain things, that it's diminished my capacity for energy and creativity and wisdom and left me confused. And so, what my intention is this week is to pay attention to those patterns, pay attention to what serves me and doesn't serve me. Holding on to a grudge at somebody else does not serve me. Holding on to a narrative about me being a victim about something does not empower me. It does not enable me to handle what's right here in front of me better. It doesn't enable me to have better creativity. And so let's allow those patterns to arise from time to time. They will, in fact, flare up in time to time. There's just a Homo sapien here that's quite limited and is going to become blind at many times. And so forgiveness is a part of this. But let's be aware of it, and let's remember that I don't have to be trapped by that. It's much more optional than I tend to believe. I tend to have this mindset that, oh, this person did this thing, therefore I am angry because of that, or I am in this situation, therefore I have to feel this way about it, or I have to be limited by it, or it is taking away, this thing out there is taking away my power over here, and I am helpless about it. But in fact, it is not true. In fact, I do have the capacity to hold all of these things from the right perspective, from the right surrender, from the right openness. I can receive all of these things. I can accept all of these things. And these things that have already happened, I might as well accept them because I can't change what's already happened. I can't change what's already arrived in this moment, including my energies and emotions about it. But I can choose to be free. I can choose to wake up from this and see, oh man, I have really woven myself a web, or I have really built myself a cage of my own narratives about how I think I need reality to be different than it actually is, or how I think I need to hold on to something that I have or push away something that I don't want to happen. And so the takeaway here for me is to regain lucidity, to regain that, okay, yes, there may be these elements of some outer storm. That may be the reality. But the tree that is rigid in the storm breaks. The tree that is flexible in the storm survives. And so, how can I use this awareness? How can I come back to the very light that recognizes the confusion? How can I come back to the very consciousness that is aware of me being contracted in this moment? How can I see that the source, the freedom that is already here is actually already here, and that much of these things that feel like traps that I'm stuck in are much more optional when viewed through a certain lens. And from that freedom, even if I can taste it for a moment, even if I can have the capacity for all this to arrive for a moment, it can keep me grounded in a perspective that's greater. It can keep me grounded in a truth that enables me to move and to accept and to rebound from whatever goes, because I'm not clinging to this narrative, self-identity, homunculus, Peyton in the head that's separate from the world and must protect himself and guard himself from all these forces. That person or that identity is already able to be seen through. It's just this cage of thoughts that I'm mistaking for who I really am. And who I really am is here, infinite capacity, already able to be glimpsed, already able to be felt, already able to be almost surrender and free fall and into. And if I can taste that, if I can touch base with that when I'm at my most contracted, when I'm feeling my most limited, it can help me to maintain a little bit of groundedness and perspective and capacity for all that needs to happen, a little bit of touch with creativity or flow, a little bit of receptivity to reality as it is, and the resilience and the anti-fragility that comes from that can make a tremendous difference in terms of walking our path and trying not to make things worse for ourselves. And so this is a lot of my intention. Really, I believe that today and the week ahead is an opportunity for me to wake up and to recognize reality, to recognize my own nature, and to recognize that I don't need to contract myself, to defend myself and prevent all these things that I don't want to think from playing out or whatever. I can actually surrender to what's real and then move with my best energy within it all. This is the path, this is the seeing, this is the way of being that is already available and that I can come back to and that I can have faith in again. How about you? What are your intentions for this week?
Well, this week I want to prepare some space much more to really examine the thoughts which come as patterns and as an observer. So therefore, again, continuing the habit of taking 12 minutes a day and just sitting there and meditating. This is my intention for this week, man. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts, and it's been a pleasure as always.
Likewise, my friend. Likewise. This has been great. I'll talk to you on the next one.
Talk to you soon, man. Bye.